Are you or someone you love struggling with ADHD? Would you like to learn more about how this condition presents itself and what treatment options are available? Would you like to know what you could do in your daily life to either help prevent or treat ADHD? Well, you're in luck because today I'll be speaking with Bernadette Abraham, who is a functional nutritional therapy practitioner and AFMC certified functional medicine coach. She is a highly engaging and sought after health expert and has over 25 years of experience in physical well-being in Canada, the US, and the UAE. She's a busy mother of 4 and holds a master's degree in exercise science and health promotion and continues to accumulate credentials as a functional practitioner. 5 years ago, Bernadette's son was diagnosed with ADHD and she went on a massive journey learning more about this condition and ways to treat it. Her son, who was once struggling with school and was considered a quote-unquote delayed learner, is now achieving improved grades, even had straight A's in one semester, is thriving and preparing for college. In this episode, she delves into the various types of ADHD diagnoses and shares valuable advice on steps to take after receiving an ADHD diagnosis, or even what to do if you think you or your loved one may have ADHD. Hi, Bernadette. Thank you so much for being here with me today. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. So happy to be here with you as well today. Excited to talk about this topic that's near and dear to my heart.
I'm so excited to talk about this as well. We're going to be talking about ADHD, ADD, and this is not a topic I typically cover myself. So I'm really thrilled to have you on to share some insights and hopefully maybe even demystify or even destigmatize the subject for many people. So maybe let's just start simply with what is ADHD and ADD and what's the difference between them?
Yeah, it's a terminology, right? So ADD stands for attention deficit disorder. And ADHD stands for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And these are both neurological conditions that affect how the brain functions, especially when it comes to focus, to impulse control, and sometimes hyperactivity. So there's been a terminology change, right? Historically, ADD was used to describe the more inattentive type. So people who are, distractible, who have a hard time focusing, might have challenges with organization and follow through. They make careless mistakes, right? These types of symptoms. And ADHD was used to describe the more hyperactive symptoms like restlessness and hyperactivity and fidgeting and not being able to, sit still and constantly be on the go. So that's historically ADHD. But today, in terms of diagnostic terminology, they've kind of clumped everything together and they call it all ADHD. So that's the proper terminology. And doctors will then specify the type that it is. So in the DSM, which is the manual that psychologists and psychiatrists use for diagnosing mental health disorders, that handbook defines it as ADHD, and then they define 3 types. So either it's, for example, they'll say ADHD inattentive type, right? Which describes the old way of saying ADD. So it's kind of become a little bit confusing because everything's clumped under ADHD. But for this conversation, I'm probably going to switch back and forth between ADD and ADHD, just because I find it's easier that way. But in terms of doctors diagnosing, it's all clumped together as ADHD, and then they specify the type.
What do you mean when you say the type? How many different types are there?
Yeah, so the DSM defines 3 types, right? There's going to be the inattentive, the hyperactive impulsive, and then there's the combined type, which can be both. But from my experience with my son, I took him to Amen Clinics in New York, and Dr. Daniel Amen himself, he discovered 7 subtypes. So we could get into that if you want, but it's a lot more than just 3 types. There's 7, and the differences are basically the root cause factors for each type and the type of treatment for each type as well. But according to the DSM, there are 3 official types, right? So inattention, like I said, it can look like someone who daydreams a lot, has their mind wandering. It could look like running late to appointments, losing things, being disorganized, having a messy desk. If it's a child, maybe having a messy backpack. That was my son. He always has a messy backpack. Forgetting to turn in assignments, making mistakes on tests that they know the material, but it's just like inattention, you know, that's the inattentive type. And then the hyperactive would be more like the Energizer Bunny, right? So much energy, always on the go, fidgeting, can't sit still, can't quiet their mind, constant movement, right? That's the people who are like shaking their legs, constantly tapping. Their behavior might be a little bit more risky also, and the decisions may not be well thought through, which then can also bleed into the impulsivity type, right? Where they may act without thinking and they might say things really before thinking it through that can get them in a little bit of trouble. So those are really, according to the DSM, the three main types: inattention, hyperactive, and hyperactive impulsive, or a combination. But like I said, from my experience working with the Amen clinics, there's actually 7 subtypes. And it's, you know, in this book, Healing ADD, it's a great resource for anybody who may suspect, like if they're listening to this and they're going, oh my God, this sounds like me, or this sounds like somebody I know, right? There's an easy way that you can kind of pick up on it. There are online assessments that can be done, right? There's a great resource for checking. It's called the ASRS for short. It's the ADHD Self-Report Scale. And it's just a simple questionnaire, right? It's free. You go online, fill out that questionnaire, and it can give a person a sense of whether or not they may have ADHD, right? And then also when I was reading this book, Healing ADD by Dr. Daniel Amen, as I was reading it also, I was kind of like, oh my God, I was able to pick up on, yeah, this sounds like my son, based on the symptoms, based on the strengths, based on the behaviors. I was kind of already able to kind of pick up on what that is. I hope that answers the question about, you know, the types. We can get into, if you want, the 7 types from Amen Clinics as well, if you'd like. But according to the DSM, those are the 3 main types.
Yes, I'd love to dig in and kind of shed a light on all these different types, because it's not common information, I don't think. But something really important that you said was, when you went to Dr. Daniel Amen's clinic, was understanding the root cause. So
Exactly.
I guess that's my next question to you, is like, what is the root cause of ADHD? Is this a genetic issue? Are we born with it? Is it something that comes from lifestyle, too much sugar? You know, we live in a world with social media and everything is so fast and there's a lot of instant gratification. So are we wiring and conditioning our brain to just be faster and more kind of chaotic? Are we wiring ourselves to be more irritable because of this modern world that we live in? So can you maybe shed some light on like the root causes of ADHD, and then maybe we can go into some of those subcategories?
Yeah, sure. I think it's all of the above. Everything that you said, I think, is accurate. So yes, there definitely is a genetic component to ADHD. So it does tend to run in families. So if you have a brother, a sister, a father, a mother who may have those symptoms, right, that profile, and then you suddenly feel like you may also have something, there may be a genetic factor that does play a big role with ADHD. But it's not entirely all about genetics, right? There's also environmental factors like exposure to toxins, right? Heavy metals, mold and mycotoxins. That's a big one. You know, environmental infections can also be part of that picture. Even environmental agrochemicals like pesticides, insecticides, you know, a non-organic way of living and eating. Nutritional deficiencies can be at play. And even physical traumas to the head, right? Injuries to the head, falls, even a whiplash. Because if you think about it, the brain is so soft. It's like butter, and it's encased in this hard shell that can have bony protrusions that any like good shake to the front and back could damage parts of the brain that could then lead to ADHD types of symptoms. And then also hormones, right? All of these can play a role in its development, and it can happen at any point in life. It's not just for kids. It can happen in children, it can happen in adults, and it can happen at various parts of life as well. So speaking of hormones, for example, right? The typical hormonal fluctuations that happens to women as part of the aging process, right? During perimenopause and also postmenopause, that loss of estrogen, for example, together with the sleep disturbances and all of the other symptoms that come along for the ride, can have a detrimental effect on ADHD. So women, for example, could have been managing really well up until that point. And then all of a sudden, perimenopause hits, right? The hormonal shifts happen, and then all of a sudden that causes trouble with their executive functioning, you know? So those, there can be many, there could be genetics, but there can also be many environmental factors that can contribute to those symptoms of inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, and lead to those types of symptoms of like the daydreamer, the wanderer, the fidgety, energetic type, and then the really impulsive kind of like just act before they think type, you know? But I just want to say something about symptoms, because we've kind of been, I've been talking about symptoms in a negative light, right? Like not being able to focus and not being able to have good memory and not being able to be being hyperactive. I think that there's a lot of focus on the negatives, but the ADHD brain can also have a lot of strengths, right? And that was one thing with my son when he was diagnosed with type 4 ADD, which affects the temporal lobe. And those are like the side of the temples behind the eyes. That affects learning, memory, auditory processing, all the things that you need for being good in school. And that's what we were realizing, is that academically, like if you didn't see him outside of school, you'd say there's absolutely nothing wrong with him. He's totally fine, normal child with a lot of strengths. But in school just couldn't perform academically because of, you know, these low blood flow areas to certain parts of the brain. And so when he was first diagnosed with that, I was like, it doesn't make sense, because you have this like preconceived notion of what ADHD should look like, right? It should be this hyperactive profile that can't focus. But then my son can hyper focus. And that's actually a strength of the ADHD brain. So when we say inattentive and you know, can't focus, it's not that they can't focus, it's that they get easily distracted and it's hard to modulate and shift focus. But if they do something that they enjoy, that motivates them, that intrinsically will produce a lot of dopamine, right? Because the ADHD brain typically is really low in dopamine. And so if they do an activity that they find super interesting and just releases lots of dopamine for them, man, they can hyper focus and lock in for hours at a time. So that's why for me, I was kind of like, it doesn't sound like him at all. Like he can focus like crazy. But then when I found out about the hyper focusing part, it totally made sense, right? And these people also are super creative. They think outside the box. You know, I have 4 kids. And if I present a problem to all of my kids, 3 of them are going to answer probably the same way, and he's going to have a completely different answer. He just thinks differently, you know, and that's not a weakness. It can absolutely be a strength. And so they're spontaneous, they're more risk takers, they're super hyper aware. There's a lot of attention to detail. I remember once we were traveling when you know, my kids were all really young. We were traveling, and then we're at the airport, and we couldn't get on our plane until we could find our baggage. And it was at a time where I can't remember why, but there was luggage everywhere. And I'm there with 4 kids by myself trying to find our luggage to make our flight. And out of all my kids, my son was like, there it is. You know, they just have this like ability to just see things that we don't see, you know? And then if they're the hyperactive type, then insane amount of energy and enthusiasm, which can go far in life in certain instances, right? So I just wanted to make sure that I highlight that, yes, it has the impulsivity, the hyperactivity, the inattention, but it also comes with a lot of strengths. So I just wanted to make sure that I get that in there as well.
I love that you bring this up, and thank you so much for sharing that. I came across some of the kind of ADHD gifts as well on the Mel Robbins podcast. I can't remember if she actually has ADHD or she had a guest, and they said very similar things to what you said,
Yeah.
that there are some things that, you know, are just a superpower for the ADHD brain. And like you said, if you're hyperactive, you could be an athlete. That could like be your superpower. You
Yeah,
might not be
exactly.
able to sit down, for hours on end and do literature and pass those exams with flying colors, but it doesn't mean that you're not physically intelligent or socially intelligent or emotionally intelligent. There's so many different types of intelligences.
Well, I think that's the biggest myth, right? Where ADHD has nothing to do with intelligence. It's an inability to be able to focus on things that you don't have interest in and being easily distracted. So if you were to take that ADHD individual and help treat that part, right? And we can get into how that can help. And then you have them take an IQ score test. They're going to score really poorly before getting like treatment for that, ADHD inattentiveness, being easily distracted. But then if you put them in an environment where all of a sudden their brain is functioning better and they can focus, they're going to score really well. It's not that they're not intelligent. It has nothing to do with intelligence, right? So that's also a big myth that they correlate it with intelligence, and it has nothing to do with that.
Such an important point to make, such an important message to share. You spoke about your son and the different kind of parts of his brain that was affected by ADHD, and you typically say the ADHD brain. So could you maybe share with us what that means? What is an ADHD brain? Maybe this is a really good segue as well to describe the 7 different types or subtypes that Dr. Daniel Amen talks about. I'm assuming it affects different parts of the brain, and then it'll present itself and manifest as a different kind of symptom or type of ADHD. But can you just walk us through like what's going on like internally?
So all the different subtypes are all going to have the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, right? Inattentive, hyperactive, impulsive. But based on the SPECT scans, that's what really drew me into Amen Clinics, is I heard him on a TED Talk, and something that he said just really like a big light bulb went off in my mind, because in the medical field, we have doctors for every body part, right? So if you have something going on in your gut, you go see a gastroenterologist. You have issues with your hormones, you go see an endocrinologist. When it comes to the brain, we have psychologists and psychiatrists, but how many of them have the diagnostic tools to actually look inside the brain, right? It's the only profession where they use a lot of the psychological assessments and symptom questionnaires, and that's all great and good, but let's go inside and see what areas of those brains are not working as well, right? What areas don't have as much blood flow, which ones have too much blood flow, and which ones are working well. And that was kind of like a big turning point in my mind, because we've been going the kind of conventional approach of seeking out psychological assessments, doing speech therapy, doing tutoring, doing all the things, the academic support, all of the things that we were told that we should be doing. But nobody actually looked inside the brain. And I was like, I want to take a more functional medicine approach, like a root cause approach. And I want to look inside his brain and see what areas aren't working well. Because in that book, if you can't fly to the US and get this done, grab the book, because although they all have the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, depending on which part of the brain is effective, it's going to have a different root cause, right? And based on that, it's going to have a different treatment. So for my son's case, it was, as I mentioned, the type 4 temporal lobe that affects learning and memory and auditory processing. And it was everything that he had been diagnosed with before, but it kind of all just made sense. So for his treatment, it was, how do we help bring better blood flow to that area of the brain? What are the activities that he could be doing? What are the foods that he could be taking? Supplements? What are the things that we could be doing to help improve those areas of the brain? And so the 7 subtypes, you're going to have the classic one. You're going to have the more inattentive one, right? The classic meaning the hyperactive, the inattentive. There's also overfocused. There's the anxious ADHD, and there's the limbic, and then there's another one he calls the ring of fire. And the ring of fire is, when you look at the SPECT scan, it's kind of like the whole area around the brain lights up. It's like really on fire. It looks like a ring of fire. And the prefrontal cortex is okay, but it's being drowned out by all the other activity around it. And so those types of profiles don't do well with stimulants, with medications that can affect that. So That's why it's really important to know what is your subtype, because then the treatment can become very customized based on your root cause, based on the location of the brain, and doing specific things that can help those areas of the brain.
Because most people who are diagnosed with ADD or ADHD are given stimulants like Ritalin, right? So you're telling me now there are 2 or 3 different subtypes where it would actually be counterproductive and potentially even harmful. So what is the limbic? It sounds emotional if I'm not too far off. And then what's the ring of fire?
Yeah, so the limbic is primarily driven by depression. The anxious one is anxiety. It deals with the basal ganglia. That part heats up of the brain. So again, different parts of the brain will light up. And this is like, he's done thousands of scans, and he's been able to kind of discover that there are 7 types. There are 7 patterns that tend to show up all the time. And that's what he's kind of shown in the scans, and that's what he's written about in this book. So that's why I think it's a super fantastic resource and reference for anybody who's kind of like, okay, I'm not ready to fly yet, but you can get this book. And if you can't read, there's an audio book that you can listen to, right, for the different learning styles. So that would be something that I would highly, highly recommend anybody starts off with, because as I was reading through it, he also has a quiz, and there's a link in the book that he shares where you can go and also do an assessment. You may even pick up just by reading the description what type you might be, and therefore he recommends what treatments would be beneficial for that subtype.
And I'll link everything below. So for the people listening, you can see in the description a link to everything that Bernadette is talking about. So easy to access. We talk about symptoms, and there are some non-typical symptoms. You mentioned depression. Some people aren't aware that there are different types of depression, and it could be a symptom of someone who's got ADHD. I've also heard of people who are struggling with sleep. They have sleep disturbances. I've heard that some people are struggling with like decision fatigue or decision paralysis or having an impaired sense of time. So again, it's like not always about, not being able to focus or being hyperactive. There are all these kind of more subtle symptoms that can show up. I guess my question for you as a mother dealing with a son that had ADHD, and I think you shared with me that you didn't really know that that's what it was in the beginning. You were just a little alarmed by his performance at school. What advice can you give to mothers who are maybe on this journey or don't know what to look out for, so that they can maybe have a better idea how to just kind of pick up the signs of the kids that they have at home?
Yeah, I would say just don't ignore it. If I knew what I knew now, and this is why I'm being so open about it, because there's absolutely so much that can be done to help the brain. Okay. I don't see it as a mental health condition. It is brain health. And there's so much that you can do to help brain health, including brain flow, including electrical activity in the brain. So if there are weaker areas of the brain that just aren't firing as well, there are things that can be done to help the brain function better, right? If it's overfiring, there are things that can help calm that electrical activity down. So knowing exactly what it is can be very helpful. Now, what I would say is we were having signs ever since he was young, like even with speech. So he was 3 years old and still not speaking. And we put him in nursery school, and the teacher would be like, use your words, because he would point to everything. And the teacher would say, use your words. And then all of a sudden, he just started blurting out sentences. They all came out. It was there, but he wasn't quite, there was always a little bit of a delay, right? And there's a 1.5 years between him and his sister. And we always felt like she developmentally would push him a little bit. So for example, when it came to swimming even, or riding the bike, she would learn it and then he would learn it. And he's older, he should have already learned that. So there was always delays, and there were always signs of just something being a little bit delayed, and nobody could ever put their finger on it. And we just always said, well, he's a late bloomer and he just needs more time. And then came school time, grade 1, where children by the end of grade 1 should be able to read. And now the teacher's calling us in and telling us, look, I think there may be an issue, because by now children should be able to read, this sentence, and he's not quite there. And that's where it really started in terms of the academics, that we always felt that there was a little bit of delay, but then he would eventually catch up. And it was never strong enough for us to kind of really dig in until it got to the point where he was fully relying, the schools were recommending that we bring in shadow support assistants. And we did, we listened. And so he had a shadow support assistant in class for certain subjects. And so that obviously you have to think about how that might make a child feel in front of his classmates, that there's a teacher sitting next to him in class, you know. It really shakes their confidence. But he wanted to do well. But I could see his confidence declining. I could tell from the baggy clothes he wanted to start wearing. I could tell from constantly wearing a hoodie or a hat, not wanting to show himself. You know, I could start to see the signs of confidence, especially that lack of confidence, especially that he has 3 other siblings who are very strong in school. And he's puts in more hours and more effort than all of them combined and still can't produce results. That's shattering to a student, to a child, you know, it shatters their confidence. And so when I saw that the measures that we were taking, the traditional measures that we were taking, the conventional measures that we are doing, that was recommended to us, when I saw that it was backfiring and he ended up losing motivation at that point because he was just relying on that shadow support assistant, that's when I said, I'm done. And that's when I decided to look at a root cause, from a root cause perspective, and start looking at the inside of the brain, getting him properly tested, properly diagnosed, and then had an action plan that we could start doing. And, you know, I have a happy ending, you know, as a result of that. In grade 8, we changed schools even. We moved from a French system to an English system, an American system. We thought it was a language barrier. You know, that helped a little bit, but it still wasn't enough. And at the end of grade 8, even after changing schools, the school said, for high school, if he's going to survive high school, he's going to need a learning support assistant in class. And I was like, I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. And I need to find real solutions for my son, because my goal, I couldn't care less about grades. My goal was that by the end of high school, whether he was able to apply to university or not, because that's the traditional path that we expect for our children, that was something in my parenting that I also had to let go and rethink, because we're just so programmed to think that after school, high school, university, like that's the path. And that may not be the path for everyone. And so I also had to reparent myself and going, that may be absolutely okay. What else can we consider? And so I wanted that by the end of high school, that he feels capable, confident, and independent and not relying on anybody. That was my goal. I couldn't care less about the grades, as long as he tried his best but in the end figured out how to be independent on his own. That's what was my goal.
Yeah, I mean, what an amazing story. And I love that you have a happy ending. And I'd love to unpack it and get into it a bit. But first, you mentioned the root cause. You did say that he had lower blood flow to certain parts of the brain. But do you understand why that happened? Did you manage to pinpoint or identify a certain environmental toxin, or, you know, eating inorganic food? Like, did you manage to pinpoint what actually caused this poor circulation to the brain? And then I'd love to get into the treatment.
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, it can be environmental. So I did do all of the tests. I did heavy metal testing. We did find silver was a little bit high. And I did end up going to another practitioner who does kind of muscle testing. And when she did the muscle testing, she did pick up that at his 2-month vaccine, that there may have been something in that. And when I looked up what his 2-month vaccine was, that specific vaccine, and I looked at the adjuvants, does have silver in it. So we did put him on a protocol for heavy metal removal. I did look into mycotox. That was clear, like mold, that was clear. The other thing is I don't know if this could be it, we will never really know, but he did fall off of the bed when he was an infant, actually, while I was changing his diaper. He was on the bed. I had turned around, split second, he rolled off and he fell off the bed. Maybe that fall could have also injured the brain. It's really hard to say exactly what it could be. But there were a few things that we found that we were working on. I did also find out that my son although we are a very healthy household, he does have friends and he does have pocket money and he does have ways of getting access to convenience stores and junk food and candy and all these artificial colors and things like that. And I found out that he was consuming that in in excess, even, not even a little bit, in excess. And that, again, is because the ADHD brain, typically the prefrontal cortex that handles, the focus and the memory and all these things, tends to be low in dopamine. And eating these types of foods gives them that hit of dopamine. So it's very addictive. So we fixed the diet. I mean, at home was already pretty clean, but we really had to get him on board with that, and explain to him that that is just not serving him, because, saying no to a child only goes so far. They have to have that intrinsic motivation to make the right choices, So I did find out from that perspective that there was a dietary issue that we had to fix. And then we just got on board on really trying to help brain health, just focusing on brain health. And it made a big, big impact, big improvements in progress.
Can you share with us what that treatment looked like? And do you think that this story of your son and the treatment that you went through with your son is applicable to others, that people listening, can they kind of apply everything that you've learned?
Yeah, absolutely. Because like I said, regardless of the subtype, they are all going to be diagnosable as having the characteristics of being diagnosed with ADHD, right? So all of the things that we've done, then other people who fall under that will also benefit. So we took a very holistic approach, which involved food, which involved certain specific activities, supplements, and then we did something called neurofeedback. So I can get into the detail if you want of, what helps, what doesn't help, right? I already talked a little bit about sugar and processed foods and artificial colors, but the other thing that we avoided dietary-wise is we got him off gluten and dairy, because those can be very inflammatory to the brain. And just by reading the book and just doing what I do, I know that for the majority of people, these are inflammatory foods. And so I just kind of wanted to get ahead of the curve. Even before we had the report, I got my son on board to remove dairy and gluten completely. Gluten is the protein found in wheat that makes it like elasticy, that makes it stretchy. And so within 2 months after removing it, I asked him, I said, after just removing dairy, not gluten at that point yet, I asked him, I said, are you noticing any differences? How are you feeling? And he says, yeah, I'm starting to feel like I could think clearer. So the brain fog started to lift, just by removing dairy. So, removing refined sugar, that's very problematic for the brain. Removing gluten and dairy, processed foods, anything with artificial colors and dyes and flavors and preservatives and vegetable oils, all those things are detrimental to the brain. So anybody will benefit from removing those from their diet. And of course, we focused on a healthy diet instead that included, healthy fats. The brain is 60% fat, right? So it would make sense that we feed it good quality fats. Our cells are made up of a bilipid layer of fatty acids. So the fats we consume, our cells, that's what they're made up of. So it's very important that we bring in good quality fats. Omega-3s are super critical for brain health. Good proteins, vegetables, fruits, complex carbs that are naturally gluten-free, right? So potatoes and rice and quinoa, even lentils and beans, those types of complex carbs were also part of his diet. And we also encouraged activities that would help bring blood flow to the brain, right? So high intensity exercises and aerobic activity, like at least most days of the week. He signed up to parkour. He loves that. And so I signed him up and he was going almost every single day. So he was not only eliminating toxins because of sweating, right? But he was also boosting serotonin, which is a feel-good neurotransmitter that for many of the subtypes, it really helps like calm down and makes them feel good. So high intensity exercise, super important for the brain. And then I was also focusing on activities that help with coordination, because that helps the cerebellum, which is at the back part of at the back of the brain, that helps with coordination between everything in the brain, including our thoughts. And so think of racket sports, right? Ping pong, tennis, fencing. He took up piano again. I got him those coloring books, the very detailed coloring books. All of those types of activities require that type of coordination that helps strengthen the cerebellum, that helps coordinate everything in the brain. So those types of activities are also really important that everybody can do, that can help with that ADHD profile, And then we also started him on supplements, very targeted supplements, so high dose omega-3s, B vitamins, zinc. What was interesting is a lot of people with ADHD also, as I mentioned, nutritional deficiencies. So we tested him for those. And his iron was low. A lot of people with ADHD tend to have low iron levels. And in fact, he was very routine at one point. He'd come home from school, grab a bowl of ice, sit down and read a book. That was his after school activity every day. And thinking back, I'm like, how did I not pick up on this? Because there's a condition called pica where you crave non-food items, right? It could be paint chips, it could be ice. And that usually happens when there's an iron deficiency. So he had that. So we replenished iron. We boosted vitamin D. And then there was a formula of nutrients that had phosphatidylserine and, adaptogens that are very focused for brain health, and very targeted probiotics, because we know that there's a connection between the gut and the brain. So really focusing on that. And that was the first part of his protocol from when we started it in the summer until the first end of semester. And I was already starting to hear from teachers who didn't know what we were doing, that they were noticing some changes. I was starting to hear positive feedback from teachers. So I already knew that things were shifting. And then the second part of his protocol was to add in neurofeedback. So have you heard of that before?
Yes, I have. Before we get into it, I just have a couple of questions about some of the things that you mentioned already. So for the nutrition part of things, I know that everyone, including people who don't have ADHD, will benefit from cleaning up their diet, removing sugar, removing gluten and dairy, inflammatory foods, et cetera, getting good quality, healthy fats, fiber, everything, and improving their gut health overall. But you mentioned activity. You mentioned two types of subtypes, which was the ring of fire and the limbic system, which is very a stimulating type of or a hyperactive type of ADHD. So I wonder if people are diagnosed with those two types of ADHD, is it good to do HIIT workouts? And because you said medications like Ritalin and stimulants are not good for this type of ADHD. So would you argue that a very high intensity activity protocol would be good for these types? Is it good for everyone with ADHD or?
Yeah, absolutely. Because they have to get their energy out, right? And like I said, energy exercise releases these feel-good hormones that can help calm the brain. So anybody who's hyper stimulating, that can be very calming for them to get out that energy, sweat, get the feel-good neurotransmitters going as well. The other thing for those types is to avoid anything that's going to deplete their dopamine, which is video games, social media, right? Doom scrolling, just constantly going. That is constantly releasing hits of dopamine. So I'm not saying never get on screens if you have ADHD, but just do it after you've completed all the tasks that you need that require sustained attention, right? And absolutely none, because you had mentioned a lot of them don't sleep well. So really avoid any screens at least an hour before bed, because that's part of sleep hygiene. If they can't quiet the mind and get good night's sleep, that's obviously going to affect their attention and their focus the next day. So getting good sleep hygiene, getting off screens at night, really limiting screen time to only after you've done the activity and the homework that you need. The worst thing that an ADHD brain can do is be studying and then wanting to take a break by getting on social media or playing a video game, because then you're just dumping all your dopamine. Then you're going to have nothing left to come back and focus and, concentrate and study again. So that's the worst thing they could do. Instead, they should go outside, play, get the energy out, and then come back in and focus. And same for adults. I would say get outside. Don't hyper caffeinate with lots of caffeine. Get outside, ground, do things that will calm you, get the natural sunshine, and then that will help boost your focus when you come back in.
I want to ask again about like HIIT workouts, so high intensity workouts, because I have people in my life that are adults and they're women of reproductive age and they have a full-time job. Some of them are consultants and they're very stressed. So we're in a chronic state now, maybe high cortisol. And let's say they're presenting with ADHD. I often, as a health coach, share with women of reproductive age, like HIIT, there's a time and a place for a HIIT workout. Please don't do it all the time and don't do it during your luteal phase. And if you're very stressed, this might add more stress to the body. So would you still advise someone who has that ADHD profile, and she's a woman of reproductive age and she's very stressed? Would you say that HIIT is still good for the ADHD brain, or would you say take it back a notch and maybe go walking, do Pilates, and do like
Yeah,
resistance
100%.
training
Tai
instead?
Chi,
Yeah, so we have to balance.
breathing,
Okay,
yoga. Yeah,
okay.
absolutely. So if this person is already chronically stressed, then adding high intensity exercise is just gonna further add fuel to the fire, and be counterproductive, right? So instead, in these profiles, you do want to be doing aerobic activity, some form of exercise, but it could be something that also matches your current circumstance that will actually benefit you instead of pull you back. So yeah, so instead, maybe swimming, maybe yoga, Pilates, Tai Chi, more deep breathing types of exercises. Absolutely.
You also mentioned caffeine, which I assume wasn't a problem with your son because maybe he's not consuming caffeine at a young age. But for adults who have ADHD, how do you feel about caffeine for the ADHD brain?
It does have pros and cons. It is probably I'm going to talk about the standard American diet, right? The biggest source of polyphenols and antioxidants in people's diets if they're following that kind of type of diet. So it can be very high in antioxidants, but it is a stimulant. And again, similar to exercise, in a lot of people who are doing it because they need it to get through the day, then that's counterproductive because you're actually not listening to your body. You're just pushing through to get through the day, as opposed to like taking that break that the body actually needs and maybe taking a rest, in the middle of the day instead of perking up and continuing to go, because that's going to affect later on in the day your sleep. And we said just how important sleep is for the brain, right? There's something called the brain needs to drain in the middle of the night. And so if you're not getting good quality sleep, it's going to affect the function of the brain the next day as well. So yes, absolutely. Time and place. I can't say yes or no for everybody. But if somebody is that chronically stressed state who's using it to self-medicate, then that's when I would say it can be harmful. But if you want to have a cup of coffee in the morning and you're not chronically stressed and you have it just that cup in the morning and nothing else in the afternoon, you switch to herbal teas, that might be okay.
Okay, great. Let's get into neurofeedback. I find this topic to be absolutely fascinating. I know it can be helpful not just for people with ADHD, but for people who deal with high levels of anxiety, potentially a depression, other kind of mental health issues. So let's please unpack this and explain to people what it is.
Yeah, so I mentioned that I went to Amen Clinics to get the SPECT scan. However, I know for a lot of people that may not be accessible. And so I would recommend then getting a quantitative EEG, right? So the brain is an electrical organ, and the quantitative EEG, or QEEG for short, is basically an electrical map of the brain. And so it can mimic the SPECT scan. So low blood flow can actually show as low electrical activity on these types of scans. And in fact, I did the SPECT scan at Amen Clinics for my son, but then when it was time to do the neurofeedback, I did it here in Dubai. And so we did the QEEG first, and the results were really similar. They were pretty much the same. We got the same results as we had gotten with the SPECT scan. So that's why I'm saying for those who may not be able to get to the US and Amen Clinics and do the SPECT scans, then you can also look for clinics in your area where they offer the QEEG It's a quantitative measurement, an electrical measurement of the brain, to see where are there areas in the brain where there's more electrical activity or where there's less electrical activity. And the neurofeedback does exactly that. So wherever it's too much activity, it can calm that down. And where there's not enough activity, it increases that. And it's like exercise. It's like working a muscle in the brain. And the way the neurologist explained it to me is kind of like you have these neural connections in the brain, right? Point A to point B, and they might be not firing well from point A to point B. And so what neurofeedback does is you think of it like this rubber band where with each session, you're stretching it and you're stretching it further and you're stretching it further until you make that connection. You've made that neural link, right? And once it's there, it's there. You don't lose it. So it's a great way to help the brain kind of bring it back to a better balance of where there's low electrical activity. It trains it to get back to a better performing area of that brain. And I'm telling you, that made such a tremendous difference. Together with that first phase of the food and the activities and all of that, adding in neurofeedback was a real game changer. And my son, actually, by the time we did 20 sessions, he's the one who came back to me and said, Mom, can I do another 10? Because he was feeling the difference. And so we did a total of 30 sessions. They recommend anywhere between 30 to 40. The downside is it's expensive. It's very expensive, and it's usually not covered by insurance. So, you have to factor that in as well. I'm very, very grateful that we were able to do this for my son because it had tremendous benefits for him. However, I did recently interview Dr. Stephen Storage from Amen Clinics, all about ADD and ADHD as well. And he mentioned this at-home basic neurofeedback device that people can use. So we never tried it, but this is something that he recommends. And it's called the Mendi, MENDI. And it's basically like a headband that you wear, and it measures the blood flow together with a phone. It measures the blood flow in the prefrontal cortex. And then based on like an activity that you do, there's a ball supposedly that goes up and down. And so you can then, with the app, know how to train the prefrontal cortex by doing certain activities to train your brain at home. So that might be an option for people who may not be able to access neurofeedback sessions. So it's Mendi, MENDI .io is the website if anybody wants to look into that.
Okay, great. We'll link that below. Can we just share with people what a neurofeedback session looks like? I think I had a little bit of a teaser at a biohacking conference last year where there was like sounds coming into my ears, and it was kind of like you said, like doing brain exercise, but and I still don't have a complete grasp of what it looks like if I were to commit to sessions or go away to a clinic. I think Dave Asprey has this clinic and you can go away for 10 days or something. So can you just shed a light on like, what does it look like to exercise the brain? What exactly are you doing in a session?
Yeah, I think it depends on the type of protocol that the neurologist puts together for you, to be honest, because when we went for the consultation, they showed us different like hats that they wear. And then there's like devices that get wired onto the brain, and then they're monitoring it on a screen. My son would call it his sleep sessions because when he first started going there, it would put him to sleep. So it's non-invasive. It doesn't hurt. It's about 45 minutes in length. And it's basically hooked up to some electrical wires, and there's something in front of you. There's either sounds, or you could be watching something and then there's sounds going on, and it's just doing the electrical exercises for you while you sit there. So it's really easy. It's non-invasive. They always do a follow-up. Like they would always call back 24 hours later and check up and ask, like, how's your son doing? And I never reported anything. So there was never a headache. Because they say you may be able to get headaches or feeling really tired that day. My son never experienced any of that after his sessions. So, but each person is different. I'm just speaking from our personal experience.
I'd also love to ask you if you think that people are being misdiagnosed with ADHD, especially like young boys who are just generally and naturally hyperactive. They might be also bored in school. They don't really want to sit down for hours on end. Maybe they're a little bit high off of sugar and candy. And we're being, we're just diagnosing our kids with ADD and ADHD, and we're prescribing them with Ritalin just so that they can survive sitting still for hours on end at school. Do you find this, I don't want to gaslight anybody who's really struggled with ADHD or who has a loved one who has ADHD, or children who are struggling with this, but do you find that, there are a lot of misdiagnoses coming out more recently because it's really just kids being kids or boys being boys?
Yeah. So again, I'm not someone who's doing diagnoses. So I actually had asked the doctor that I had interviewed, Dr. Stephen Storage, a similar question, saying like, I feel like ADD, ADHD is on the rise. And are you seeing a lot of misdiagnoses where maybe it could be or couldn't be? And he said, absolutely. So I think the reason why it is on the rise is probably because twofold. One, we have more access to resources now, right? So there's social media. There's a lot of information out there. There are podcasts talking about ADD, ADHD. And so with that level of awareness, people are kind of going like, I see myself in this, and then pursue further testing with these free online resources and books to be able to kind of self-diagnose, right? But it's very important though. And as I had mentioned, the rigorous testing that my son underwent, it wasn't just one assessment questionnaire. It was 17 pages. There was also, he was seated in front of a computer and they were checking his emotional intelligence by looking at things on the screen. There was another test where there was a little X and he had to press the bar every time that X came up to check his reaction time, in addition to the scan that they did for the brain. So they really looked at it was a very holistic view before we were given that diagnosis. And so if somebody was given a diagnosis just based off of a questionnaire, then I would be skeptical, and I would maybe get a second opinion. And remember, there are things it's not just genetics, there's also environmental factors. We touched on food, we touched on activities, we touched on a lot of things that can be detrimental for the brain. So start with the basics first, right? How is their diet? What is that like? Are they eating a lot of refined sugar? Are they eating a lot of processed foods with artificial colors and artificial dyes and vegetable oils? Are they sedentary or are they exercising? Are they doom scrolling, on social media all the time? Or are they outside playing a lot, getting sunshine? Right? Start with the basics first. And if things don't shift with those, basic foundational healthy lifestyle activities and foods, then maybe pursue that further with additional testing, getting a second, third opinion. But I hope that the doctors that are out there that are giving those diagnoses are doing a thorough assessment. Like you said, we don't want to gaslight anybody, and I hope they're doing a good job with that. But a lot of the problem in this space is that a lot of them just stop at the subjective assessment. And that's where I feel there's a big missing gap. And I feel like we really have to look at the brain, whether it's a SPECT scan, whether it's with a QEEG scan, that needs to be part of the picture in order to get a correct, accurate diagnosis. So I hope that kind of answers the question a little bit.
Yeah, that answers the question. And I think the most important thing you said is get proper testing and speak with a proper doctor and practitioner, because I think also people are self-diagnosing, or they're maybe even self-diagnosing their kids. But as you said, let's start with the basics. Let's get them off sugar. Let's get them moving their bodies. And then let's see if they can concentrate better, because all those things can play a very important role in how they do at school or how they are at life, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you did touch on medication, that it's kind of the first thing that people go to. And there are probably instances where medication is appropriate. Medication was one of the potential treatments that was offered for my son, but I decided to go, you know what, let's exhaust all of the natural options first and see how far we get. And if it's then still needed, then I'm totally open to it, because I want him to do better, right? And so there are certain situations where it may be totally appropriate. We did not need it at all. I exhausted all of those natural options, including the neurofeedback, and it just was incredible, the changes that we saw in him. That's all that it took in his situation. So That's not to say that those that are using medication, it's wrong. But if you are not addressing diet, not addressing sleep, not addressing the lifestyle activities, being active, and just relying on the medication, I think there's a missed opportunity here, right? Not just for ADHD, but just also overall health, right? So definitely consider all of those things.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. Before we close, is there any other advice you'd like to share to the adults listening to this podcast? Maybe we do a quick recap as well, or maybe we share, places that they can start if they feel like they might have an attention deficiency disorder or they've already been diagnosed with it, but they're a bit confused. We did cover some nutrition aspects, we did cover activity, but is there anything else you'd like to leave them with?
Yeah, I think we touched on pretty much most of what, also what we did for my son. But as a starting point, like I mentioned, I would start with the book because I think that's the most accessible, and the free online assessments that I had mentioned, that you can go and take. Because you can really find yourself in there. And there's a lot of resources in the book in terms of treatments for that specific type that you may be able to find yourself in. So that would be a really good place to start. I would then also look for centers in your clinics in your area, neuroscience centers, neurologists, that offer the QEEG scan and neurofeedback, and see if that would potentially be something that would be beneficial for you. I would look at the Mendy. If cost-wise that's not an option for you, then maybe looking at a home type of neurofeedback solution could be an idea. And if people need help with their nutrition, right? Healthier eating at home. I'm a nutritionist and I'm in functional medicine. So for me, that was the easy part in terms of getting the diet back on track and making sure he's getting in the right nutrients. But I know that for a lot of parents, that's a big sore point because society just doesn't help parents raise healthy eaters. And that's actually the topic of my book on junk, how to raise healthy eaters in a processed world. So if anybody's struggling to get their kids to eat healthier, right? When they're young, it's easy. You can control what's at home and you can control what they eat. But when they get older and they start accessing, friends' foods, going to friends' places, going to malls on their own, then they have to be making those choices for themselves. So how can you empower them to make those right choices for themselves? That's the tricky part. That's the real parenting part. And so my book is a resource that I have created for parents and families, because there are even scripts in there where you as the parent can read it to the child, or you can have your child read that specific section, because that's kind of the strategy that I used over the years with my kids to kind of educate them and raise their level of awareness. Because once they have a good understanding, then they will want to make healthier choices themselves. And then when they get to the teenage years, they're going to rebel. It's natural. You have to understand that kids go through different stages of life. But then when they start to get the pimples and they start looking at themselves, and then you can start saying, well, it's because you ate that and because you ate that. So you could use that in your favor. But then they will start to kind of come back to all the lessons that you've been teaching them and mimicking you, right? You are the biggest example for your kids as well. So you just basically be the model that you want your kids to be, And then also in Be Better, which is my health membership, it's a platform to make functional medicine more accessible and help people get to the root cause. I, as I mentioned, interviewed Dr. Stephen Storage all about ADD and ADHD as well. And so there's a recording of that inside Be Better. Anybody can just create a free account and access that for 5 days. And if they want more help, they need more help or more resources, then we have a private forum where people can be completely anonymous and when they can get help from me and my functional medicine practitioner. So all those resources available that I would recommend looking into and hopefully getting the help that they need.
I mean, the book on junk, we need one for adults as well. It's not just for kids, like how to motivate adults to make better choices, right?
Yeah, it goes for anyone who wants to improve their nutrition.
Yeah. You speak about functional medicine. Would you say it's an appropriate and maybe even necessary first step for adults or kids who are maybe struggling with ADHD, or you don't even have a diagnosis yet, would you say it's an appropriate first step to do some functional testing, like do a whole gut health test, a GI test? Is it important to do maybe a Dutch test, a toxin test? Like, is this an important first step, or would you say that this is maybe necessary at the second or third step when you understand what's going on in the brain? Because I know functional tests can be quite expensive, but it's very comprehensive and more comprehensive than conventional testing. So would you recommend that be a necessary first step?
Not the first step, no, because you could just go down a rabbit hole. Like you said, it can be very expensive. I would just start with the free online assessments. And if you do suspect that there's ADHD, then go and get a proper holistic assessment that involves not only subjective assessments, but a look at the brain as well, right? The scans, the QEEG, the SPECT, all of these things together with I remember when we went to Amen Clinics, I filled out 17 pages, something like that, front and back of questionnaires. So it was very thorough, it was very holistic in terms of getting to that diagnosis. But then once you have it, then you could look at, okay, what could potentially be the root cause for that specific type? And then you could look at, could it be environmental? Is there anything in my home? So then you might want to do a mycotox test. Is it something that happened later in life when you were menopausal or perimenopausal? Then perhaps a Dutch test would make more sense, to do a hormone test to see where your levels of hormones are. So I think it's very important first to get clear on what it is that you have, because then the treatment and the testing that comes after that can be very specific instead of just going on this wild goose chase and spending a lot of money. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks for clarifying. My last question to you is, so after your experience with your son and this huge journey that you've been on, would you say that ADHD is curable, or is it just something that you eventually end up managing?
So some people are going to really not like that question, right? Because they're going to say it's not a disorder, it's not a weakness, so it's not something that can be cured. But I asked this question specifically because I saw the amazing improvement in my son. I told you in grade 8, when we made that decision to go, enough, we're going to start looking at root cause. He's now in grade 12. I did not think in grade 10, because academically his GPA was just not high enough to be able to potentially, apply to universities. So I told you that wasn't something that was on our radar. But come grade 11, end of grade 10, grade 11, he really pulled around and he made honor roll for the first time. He got straight A's in the semester. And it was just like, again, I don't focus on grades, but just so happy for him, that he felt good, that he was actually putting in the effort and actually seeing the results this time. And I'm just so proud to say that we just finished applying to universities because he was able to pull his GPA enough to meet that minimum requirement for universities. And he wants to go to university. So that's our happy ending. He's more confident. He's more definitely independent. He just has done so much effort, and just so proud of this kid, honestly. And so I asked that question because it was such a huge transformation for my son. I asked Dr. Amen, not Dr. Amen. I asked Dr. Storage, who I interviewed in Be Better, is it something like type 2 diabetes where it can be, if it's lifestyle environmentally triggered, that it can be reversed? And he said, absolutely. And I was like, okay, there's my answer. So I think in my son, we absolutely did reverse it. Here's the thing though, is it can always come back, right? If it is a genetic component to it as well, that we may not know, it can always come back. If he goes back to eating junk food and he goes back to eating, sugars and processed dyes, maybe there's an injury to the head later on in life, it can always come back. So yes, it's reversible and it can be maintained as well, but it can always, like I mentioned, with women later on in life, because of hormonal fluctuations, present itself again in other ways, so yes and no. It's something that you would definitely want to kind of just keep on your radar and maintain, and know that you probably can have to put in effort for brain health to really kind of stay at a level where you're comfortable and doing well,
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. I think comparing it to type 2 diabetes really kind of made me conceptualize what you mean, that you can reverse it, but it's just something you have to keep your eye on. Bernadette, thank you so much for this conversation. It was extremely enlightening and insightful. You are a wealth of knowledge. I really appreciate your time. Um, I've learned a lot from you today, so thank you so much. Where can people find you? I will link your book and Be Better website down below. But if somebody would like to contact you or work with you or learn more about what you do, where can they find you?
Yeah, well, I'm on social media, so you can also link my Instagram page where I share, health information there as well. And Be Better would be the best place if they would like to work with me. That's probably the best place because I literally answer people there every day in the community forum to help them get to the root cause and give them the resources that they need for help and support. Really just trying to make access to functional medicine more affordable, more accessible to more people.
And do you work with people who have ADHD? Like, can they come to you to work with you and to get advice and support from you medically or as a practitioner?
So one-on-one, I'm very limited, and that's why I've created Be Better to be able to help more people. So it's probably going to be difficult to work one-on-one, but if they do need help, then absolutely they can find me and get help and support inside Be Better as well.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great. It was a pleasure being here.
Thank you for listening. Please share with family and friends that you feel could benefit from this episode, and make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a rating and review to support the show. Check out the links below for more information about my guests and where to find them. And make sure you're following me on Instagram at wholesome_practice to learn more about what I do. I appreciate you being here, and see you on the next one. This podcast is for educational purposes only and should never replace the advice of your doctor or physician. Always consult a medical professional before making any changes or adding anything new to your diet, lifestyle, or medication protocol.